What are some of the roles that story plays in our personal and collective making of meaning?
All this stuff that's moving is actually moving through us and moving through our neighbors. And so these things do link us together in these bigger patterns.
Welcome to the Frequency Files. Thanks for joining us as we explore the vibrations, forms, and creations and mechanisms behind them that inform the nature of existence. Bernard, it's awesome to chat with you today. Your expertise and passions intersect with so many different places, spaces, and disciplines. And that's something I find really fascinating about you and about the way you see the concept of frequency and the various definitions that it can have. So I'm really looking forward to having you here and chatting with you further. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh no, thanks very much, Sarah. I'm really excited about this actually. I've never done a podcast before, so this is it's a special moment, really, isn't it? Your first time doing something. My podcast frequency is currently 0, and I'm bumping it up to 1.
Woo! Great. Love that.
I thought it would be a nice, like a little dovetail into the subject that we're going to talk about.
Yeah, awesome. Could you share with our listeners a little bit about your background and what led you to being here today?
Well, I think like a lot of people, you come from different places in your life and it kind of just grows together over time. When I was young, like a child, I was really into science and particularly natural history. And I used to spend a lot of time just outdoors, in the environment. I'd go out collecting plants and, I'd spend hours, watching spiders weave webs and all that sort of stuff. Occasionally, of course, being a young boy, I'd occasionally feed the spider in the web, something. That's what we do. But yeah, I was really intrigued about that. And I guess, that's where I started from. So I had this deep love of science. And I have, of course, that goes with our real appreciation of numbers because science is often described in numbers. We often look at frequency or probability, probability being frequencies, I guess, twin out in the universe, to describe things that occur in nature. And so I guess that was one part. And I guess the other thing that I was really into as a child was stories like but history and mythology and all of that sort of stuff. And I read copiously. I was really I still am, I still read all the time, but I really love reading history. And you, as you read more and more history, you start to see patterns in it. You start to see things that it's not like the same thing happens, but it's like it resonates. There's a resonance out there in history. And I guess when you sort of look at mythology, you start to see different like cultures that have nothing to do with each other, weirdly coming to a similar space in many ways. And completely independently. Like it's like this, they've got nothing to do with it. There's no overlap, for millions of years, but for some reason they sort of end up in a similar place, which I find intriguing. Like I guess an example of that would be hieroglyphs. They originated in ancient Egypt, of course, with pyramids, and then in South America, we see a version of hieroglyphs starting to evolve in Aztec civilization as well, and pyramids too. So, these quite disparate cultures that are separated by time and distance, and yet, weirdly enough, they come up in the same place. And so you start to see these, I don't know, themes, I guess. And I guess that's what, for me, I had these two things, this, deep love of science, but at the same time, this deep love of story. And then, fate threw me a bit of a curveball when I finished university. So I actually chose to pursue science when I went to university as a very young man. But when I graduated science here in Australia, which is where I live, in 1991, so that sort of gives away my age, we had a recession here and they didn't have any investment in science. There's no jobs in science at all. They just pulled all the money out of it. And as a chance, we have a friend of mine took me to a blues jam actually at a local pub. And I could play a little bit of flute and a little bit of record. And I said, which one you bring? So I'll bring the flute. And that sort of just took my life in a completely different dogleg because I realized that I could become a musician, because I could create my own job. Like I couldn't find employment, but I could make my own job as a musician. So at around the age 20, I went from this, I'm going to be a scientist, to I'm going to be a musician. So, and that was such a radical change in my life. And it's been a permanent change actually, because it's something I started and then I just kept doing because the crazy thing about music is it actually brings together all the science I liked and all the storytelling I like too. So it's an art form that is a synthetic art form. It brings different things together, and you can weave things in music, which is quite intriguing actually. And so that's a little bit about my background there. So yeah, I'll hand back to you now for your next question. This is intriguing. I'm loving this.
Yeah, awesome. Awesome. Yeah, I love the diversity of your background. It's really cool. And another part of your history and the work and contribution, I'd say like zone of genius you have is the work you do in communities.
Well, yeah, this again, I mean, like there's random points in your life where your life takes a bit of a change. So, yes, in my 20s, I was a musician. I toured and I put bands together, put albums together. And as I got older and as I decided to get married and have children, I wanted to have a bit more of a stable income, to be quite honest. And I started fishing around for something else to do. And I landed a communications job because the secret skill of every musician out there is marketing because at the end of the day, you want people to come to your performances, and the way you do that is by letting them know that they're on. And so I got a job as a junior marketing officer to run an art competition for Queensland Transport. And the art competition was called Travel Smart Schools. And what it was basically is to go out into schools and the students had to like draw how they could get to school actively, like by walking or riding their bike or doing something like that. And, government, they were pouring a bit of money into this exercise. Anyway, I thought this sounds like a complete waste of effort to be absolutely honest. And I thought we can do better than this. And so I started doing a little bit of research. By the way, I was just there on a contract. I wasn't a permanent job or anything. And I was really junior. I was like right at the bottom of the ladder. But, when you're working up in the arts, you don't really know how bureaucracy works. You're a bit of a grifter, to be quite honest, and you have to learn to be a bit cheeky in life. And so I did a little research and I realized that, what this is more broadly tapping into is this idea of behavior change, getting people to adopt new behaviors that are more sustainable. And as I looked into that, I realized actually that we could do a lot better. And so I actually started to sign up a whole different program about an actual behavior change program about getting kids to at least walk part of the way to school or ride their bike for the last few hundred meters, whatever. But the idea is that, if even didn't matter how far away from the school you lived, you could always walk that last ten minutes, that last leg. And of course, what we discovered rapidly is actually a lot of kids live within about a 10-minute walk of school. So once they worked out they're walking the last 10 minutes, most of them end up walking the whole way because particularly in primary schools, about 80% of the population lived about a kilometre from the school and which is about a 10-minute walk. And so they'd spend like a good hour trying to drive to school and all the heavy traffic or park and do all that hoo-ha when they were literally living a 10-minute walk away. And they only had to do it once to realize that possibly they could have been doing something different. So when first developed the program, I saw some massive shifts in people's behavior. Like you'd see, average school would have about 10 to 20% of kids walking to school beforehand. And we're getting up to above 80% of kids walking to school, got the teachers involved. We created a student leadership program out of it, just did the whole, and the idea was really to get the kids empowered to deliver the program themselves. So we tapped into the year six kids, they ran it, they owned it. And as on a whole, a lot of schools absolutely loved it because they were looking for opportunities like this. They wanted something the kids could genuinely do and have complete agency over. And had the side benefit, of course, helping them learn some basic life skills like how to cross a road, and also just to be a little bit more active in how they're growing up. Because if you're active as a child, you're active as an adult. Actually, I should declare something else about my child, which is probably a little bit unusual. I wasn't actually born in Australia. I was actually born up in Papua New Guinea, and not only in Papua New Guinea, but actually in the remote highlands of Papua New Guinea, a tiny village on the roof of the world. And And the only way to get around up there was in fact to walk, and not when we say walk, we're walking over mountain ranges. These were not idle walks. And so I grew up walking. So for me, when I first came to Australia, I was really bemused that people actually didn't walk very much because, as a child, I walked all the time. And I actually still do. I think it's just ingrained habit from when I was a kid. So of course, this active travel stuff, it was like a duck to water. And so I did that for a while. And then I realized that actually, you could take these learnings, take these skills and apply them in other ways. And so I moved on from the transport stuff. And I started working for local government and also for in the charity sector, developing up programs about giving people agency. And so one program I developed up for the Advanced Breast Cancer Group here in Queensland, which is for women, psychological support for women who have secondary or advanced breast cancer. And a lot of these women are kind of like not cared for in the primary breast cancer sort of sector, because it's seen as bad news, really. I mean, and it kind of is, but anyway, I won't get into that part of it. But anyway, so I developed up programs for them about helping them connect to their families outside of cancer. So when you get cancer, you go to a doctor a lot, you sort of lose part of yourself. So my program is called Memory Box. Every woman got a box, which is like a legacy box. But also it was about gathering their stories and giving them back to them and teaching them that they had stories that were not about cancer, that were about funny Christmases and childhood experiences and about connecting with kids and all this other stuff that they had in their life. Again, it was all the stories. And with the council I was working for, developed all these sort of programs around getting arts and business back into centres, reclaiming places that have become vacant or starting to fall down over time, and getting community involved in really important decisions as well. So and I actually really love that work, and I still do it actually. It's part of my day job actually at the moment. And so it's still work I do to this day, and I work with all sorts of different projects and go out and talk to a lot of people and hear what they have to say, and think about it. You reflect on all the things you're hearing, and I think this probably starts to tap a little bit into your podcast here, because the more you hear people, the more you start to hear themes, which of course is the frequency of story. How often are you hearing a story that's different every time, but it seems to overlap into something that's more revealing about, I guess, what are fundamental human needs and drivers. So yeah, so I think that idea of a narrative frequency is out there a little bit, actually.
Mm. What are some of the things that you've discovered around that?
Well, I mean, this is going to be like a jumping around sort of conversation, so I hope that's okay. So I'm just going to go a little bit back to writing songs and, writing music and that sort of thing. Because when you write, when you choose to spend a life writing stuff, the one thing you start to look for is things to write about, because you know and I guess it's some writers write a lot about themselves. They have a life where they're unpacking themselves a lot, like they've been through trauma or they've been through a range of challenges, and so there's a lot of ground for them to resolve, and they use their art as a means of regaining power, I guess, in their life in doing that. My path's been a little bit different. I think possibly because I haven't had a life that's been so challenging. My life has actually been quite cruisy, actually, in the scheme of things. It's had its challenges, but it's not. I haven't lived a really terrible life at all. I've lived quite a happy one. So I'm very drawn to looking at other people's stories. The stories that I hear from people, but also the stories I read. And initially, for example, it was mythology I was very drawn to. So I had my first band that I started in my early 20s. It was all about, I guess, writing songs that were based in these, Celtic and other myths, so to speak. And I started to really unpack old stories. And and what I started to discover was, again, this idea of like a narrative frequency or narrative, I know, landscape out there where you sort of see the same story start to happen again and again and again. And I'll give you an example of one if you like. Um, and I've written a song about it actually. So it's a good link. But there's an old Scottish story called it's got a range of names, but the name I know it as is called the Twa Corbies, which means the two crows. Um, the crazy thing is that I've never found a version of the story that actually has two crows in it. So, but I think what it might refer to is there's always two sisters. Um, and these two sisters, they don't get along that well. And there's usually a suitor or a man involved. And there's like a sort of strange love triangle going on. There's a range, there's about but what I'd found is actually there's not one version of the story. It's like 15 versions of the story out there. And different people have turned it into a song over time. Probably my favorite version of it, and I direct anyone listening to this podcast to go and look it up, is by a Canadian singer called Colleen McKennitt, and she calls her song "The Wild Swans," and it is absolutely beautiful. It's like one of the most haunting things you will ever listen to in your life. There's another one I got a bit obsessed with for a while called "The Seven Swans," which is about a girl who rescues her brothers or other men folk in her family, and sometimes there's five of them, sometimes there's seven of them, sometimes there's 12 of them. But basically in this story, she goes on a journey and she has to overcome a range of challenges. And in the end, she succeeds and she frees, her siblings. Like a lot of European folklore, it's got a dark sting in the tail. Like, European folklore is actually quite dark when you look at the original stories, because one of her brothers, she doesn't quite lift the curse. So he usually has one arm that's still a swan's wing. So she doesn't completely lift the curse. But yeah, you find these stories coming around and around and around and around. And and I guess that's partly what made me think, okay, there's like these base stories of humanity that we keep coming back to again and again. Maybe there's like this collective consciousness or collective angst that we have to work through as a big community somehow to see if we can find some answers to it. So we just keep reinvestigating it. And when you think about it, there's other examples of these core storylines out there. Like when we look at, say, Shakespeare and Romeo and Juliet, this story of forbidden love is one that comes back. This idea of star-crossed lovers, two people who are meant to be together, but for one reason or another cannot be together. And I've heard the same story told to me by Quantamuka songmen on Stradbroke Island, and it's an underpinning story about how Morton Island and Stradbroke Island became separated. I mean, I won't repeat it here because it's not my story to repeat, but I just found it fascinating, this idea of these two star-crossed lovers. It doesn't matter where you go, you find a version of it. Like it's just everywhere in the world. There is a story out there where two people are meant to be together, but for some reason they just cannot be together. I find it intriguing that as a species community, we keep coming back to these ideas again and again and again to try and work out what is the answer. Or maybe it's not even to work out the answer. Maybe it's just to collectively grieve through that process repeatedly over time to try and work these feelings out of us. Yeah, so I don't know. It's kind of my theory. Maybe it's another theory. I should do some research and find out if other people have come up with this. But this idea of like narrative frequency is one that kind of intrigues me a little bit, actually. Hmm.
Mm-mm. And the collective unconscious, right? Like that's playing out at a personal or communal or a universal level. And it makes me think of, even Jungian 12 archetypes type thing, or Carolyn Meese has her version of archetypes, or there's debates about, that there's four universal archetypes: the child, the victim, the prostitute, the saboteur.
Oh
Um,
yeah, I haven't heard that.
yeah.
Okay, yeah. I mean, archetypes, are often in stories,
Mm.
we see them all the way through to popular culture now. I mean, like and I think they have a function. They're a character in a story. And I guess that character probably distills a range of like values or assumptions into one entity. Um, I guess what I'm thinking is about moving away from the archetype and just looking at the story itself. because these stories could have a range of archetypes in them. You know, so for example, star-crossed lover, Romeo and Juliet, that archetype is about two young lovers. They're teenagers, which makes the story all the more tragic and all the more poignant. But when we look at, say, Camelot, the story of Camelot, and we have Guinevere and Sir Lancelot, they're adults. And actually they've got a lot of agency, they're quite powerful figures. But again, we've got two lovers that want to be together but cannot be together. They're forbidden to be together. And we know that when they get together, disaster is going to happen. It's going to be a tragedy. So vastly different archetypes, but exactly the same storyline, if that makes sense. Just to give you I guess two quite contrasting European versions. I mean, I'd be fascinated to, as I said, I've heard some versions of the story from traditional owners in Australia, but I mean, I'd love to look at this idea a little bit more and see how it resonates across cultures and have conversations, with people from those cultures about I guess some of the things that I see from my own culture and see how it resonates for them and if they see the same patterns in their own stories. I'd be really intrigued by that actually. I think it'd be a really good
Mm,
thing to do.
mm,
Yeah,
mm,
so because I think a lot of focus is given to archetypes because it's a nice way to pigeonhole people and as a species humans we just love categorizing. Man, if we can put someone in a box, we are so there. We would do it at the drop of a hat. But I
mm,
think moving away from that and looking at the tail is another way of looking at the same problem but possibly through a slightly different lens. Yeah. What's
okay.
your thoughts on that? I'm intrigued by your thinking.
Yeah. I mean, I've got a lot of planets in Gemini. I can see both sides of the coin here. And like I I think an archetype, depending how you play with it or or how it occurs to you, I think of it more as a energetic, universal, thematic impulse.
Oh
Like
yeah.
that is playing out in within the self, because we've all got different parts of us that are playing out at different times. So
Mm.
it's not about a categorization, but it just an aspect of expression. So those qualities or dynamics may play themselves out in ways that look really different or in environments that look really different, but the key aspects of self that are getting very activated in the exchange between the humans or the personified, anthropomorphic characters
Mm.
can have an archetypal quality to it.
Oh yeah. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah,
I
how
don't know, but
intriguing.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that, when I talk to writers about how they write, often they won't think of the story first. They'll think of characters first. And then they put the character into a situation. And then the story is really about how the characters respond to the situation. And great stories do that. Like even like take Romeo and Juliet, we have these two very strong characters. You know, they're put in this impossible situation. What do they do? How do they resolve it? And based on all the assumptions and I guess the baggage of the time, particularly because in Shakespeare's there was a lot of baggage floating around. So he definitely wrote for his period. So that's how a lot of writers will write actually. They really think of the person first. And yeah, which so I think there's a truth in what you were saying. There's these aspects of personality that float around and they give an aspect of archetype in them. Of course the person themselves is way more complicated than an archetype, but they lend themselves to that. And and I think it's
Mm,
a point of identification.
mm,
I wrote a book many years ago about the value of nursery stories for young children. And, as I said before, traditionally nursery stories were not sanitized. They were quite dark and often had quite brutal endings to them. And they're the versions that kids learned. I mean, I don't know if you've read Brothers Grimm, but it's they're grim by name and grim by nature. They're not happy tales necessarily, but they're tales that were told to children for hundreds of years. And anyway, so this research was looking at, well, why do kids like these stories? And what he twigged to is actually the kids liked them because it gave them role models in a way of how to react and act. But it wasn't necessarily the hero that they were resonating with. It often was the villain. And what the child wanted to do was to explore what a bad choice might look like, or you know, what a cheeky or a destructive set of actions might look. That's what they needed to work through, and so in Rumpelstiltskin himself was actually the character that a lot of kids really wanted to know more about. Because he's just such a horrible character. He's awful. Like there's almost no redeeming qualities to him when you read the original stories. He's terrible. And there's no good about this character. But kids, it's like they need to work out in a safe way where there is not a repercussion for their actions, what it means to behave like that. And I found that a really intriguing piece of research, actually. And I mean, going back to, I guess, my little pet about this idea of narrative frequency, because the one thing I find intriguing about frequency from a science point of view is that it's additive. So when you go out into nature and you're looking something that has frequency, say waves at a seashore, you look at the waves rolling in, coming in. And on a nice calm day, they'll roll in nice predictable breaks, and that's the day, that a lot of surfers like to go out. They love that. They're almost that uniform height, that uniform speed, nice, even sets of waves coming in. But when the weather changes a little bit, the behavior of the wave changes a bit because frequency or phase cancellation starts to kick in. And so when you get a bit of wind behind the waves, it's pushing the waves a bit faster, so their frequency is speeding up. And sometimes those waves will overlap on each other. And when they overlap, they add together and the wave gets bigger. And this happens with sound, with anything that has a frequency or an amplitude. When you add two of them together, they get bigger if they're moving in the same direction. But if they're moving in opposite directions, they'll actually cancel each other out. They'll get way, way smaller. And you can see this again at the beach when you go and stand on a headland. You'll see one set of waves rolling in. It'll hit the shore, and then another set starts to roll out. And where they meet, you'll see it actually gets a little bit choppy, but actually the average height of the wave will diminish because they're canceling each other out in different ways, and sometimes quite unpredictable ways. And I wonder myself, whether a similar principle applies with stories. If you've got a very strong story and then you've got another story that comes alongside it and sort of like starts to cancel it out, what happens then? What happens in the choppiness of it? And I feel at the moment we see this a lot in how you know uh political forces are choosing to engage in society. You know, society often has these very powerful positive stories. They may have come from, a spiritual basis, or they may have come from other narrative sources, or movies like, even say something like Star Wars, broadly positive story, in terms of good versus bad and good wins. And so there's all these powerfully good stories out there, but often, they'll deliberately try and put other narrative out there that tries to counter that, to counter the idea that maybe we should just all get along. Maybe like, well, we'd be better if we just rubbed along together, and we see this thing saying, well, actually, what about this? Or what about that? These people are, I don't know, criminals or rapists, or I don't know, whatever, word you want to stick in the mix, really. And they pump this stuff out like a fire hose to try and muddy the waters of how our consciousness works from a story point of view. And I know this is slightly, I don't know, political space to be, and I don't want to be political, by the way, but it's just looking at the idea of story. Now you have one narrative come in, someone putting out an opposing narrative, and then suddenly everything just gets a little bit murkier. you know. We see the stories start to rub up against each other and people react to them in different ways. And sometimes the act, what it does is it makes someone stronger in their views, one way or the other. They get reinforced by the story in some way. Sometimes they just don't know what to think, and they end up in this kind of like I don't know, zero state, this null state where they're being buffeted by the fortresses and they don't quite know which way to go. And I see that particularly in some younger people, they like so much is getting at them and they just want to switch off, to be honest. It's like, let me plug into my music and try and tune it out. It's like that. Yeah. So but yeah, this I thought I'd chuck that idea into the mix about, just like in nature, maybe we have phase cancellation in this idea of narrative frequency out there.
I love that. And I love you drawing that bridge because it's so real for all of us, whether it's our internal narratives, narratives we have about ourselves, about what's true or not true, what life is or isn't, what our communities, environments, families, blah blah blah, you name it. We've got all sorts of definitions that we hold or don't hold or
Mm.
question or don't question that can have really polarizing impacts internally. And then when we bring that out into the collective and the role that narratives play, I mean, look at, what drives, the news. If it bleeds, it leads. So,
That's it. Yeah, yeah,
right. And similarly for positive press and the potential that that can have to redirect focus, to redirect energetic investment in where the mind goes, energy flows.
yeah. I guess in saying this stuff, I think I guess my goal really is just to help people think, well, become more conscious about what might be impacting them. Because often, like these stories are quite unconscious. We just absorb them like osmotically, really, as we grow up. Our parents tell them, or we go to a church and we hear them, or we get them at school, or we just from what we read, or what comes at
Yep.
us on TV or whatever. And but we get them osmotic. We're not really consciously choosing our stories. And it's the same, with a fire hose of stories that then get spread out by, those with political intent. We're not really choosing to get those stories either. But I think we can choose when we become conscious that that's actually what's going on. We get a little bit more agency and a little bit more power over stories that we're actually taking on, you know, and that's when we can reclaim our choice. But we can say, okay, all right, now I get what's going on. Actually, I like this story more than I like that story. I like this one more than that one. And at that point we start to get our power back. Because otherwise we're just being pushed along by the wind. I think for me as an artist too, what is intriguing was a writer, because I mean, one of the things I love doing is writing songs, and I like finding topics to write songs about. And so part of my practice, as I said, I used to look at mythology, but part of my practice these days is I go out and talk to people, and I talk to a lot of people, and I'll invite them to tell me about their life, and sometimes I say, oh, if you want a song, I'll just write you one. You tell me what it's about, and I'll whatever style, and I'll write that song. Though I'm listening to everything else that they're saying, and so when they get this song, it's usually a bit of a surprise, because what I've done is I've not just listened to what their request was. I've listened to everything else they've told me as well, and
Mm.
woven it in. But I find it interesting, this finding song topics is like, okay, well, because you're hearing a lot of towels. And so what I'm trying to choose now is topics that will mean something to somebody else. So as people are telling me their stories, I'm thinking, oh, okay, this story sounds a bit like this. It sounds like this other one that I've heard, or it overlaps with this idea. And you started to think, well, what's a really great example story? And so the song what I'm finding now is the songs that I'm writing, often what I'm doing is I'm finding a great example of something I've heard a few times from different people. I think, that's it. And if I write that song, actually all these other people are really going to really going to resonate for them too, because I think, oh, there's someone like me, and that's what music can do. It can establish that idea that I'm not alone. We actually, I feel that way too. That's me. And you realize when you feel less alone, you just feel better. There's someone else like you in the world. So that's
Mm.
something I'm very much engaging with in my practice now, to go out and find stories and gather them up and take notes, and then to look at, I guess, the broader themes that are coming out in these stories. And one thing I'm hearing a lot right now, like to move from the past to the present, is, I'm hearing a lot of stories about how our human world is changing in our evolution as humans through technology. You know, it's the ground is shifting now underneath us, and I find that intriguing how different people are reacting to that in different ways. So some people really engage with it. Some people want to shut it out. Like one person I wrote a song for, their job is actually in IT, it's in technology, it's in all this stuff of the future, but in their own life, they don't even have uh, uh, anything that streams in their house. When they go home, everything is purely material. Like their activities are hand activities. They make things, they craft things, they play board games. There's no screen, there's no device in their other time. So their reaction to technology is to compartmentalize it. It's in that corner, and I'm going to keep it in that corner. Thank you very much. And I find that really intriguing, actually. How people are choosing to cope with all this change. It's like coming at us so fast at the moment. It's just crazy, isn't it? Yeah.
It's huge. It's huge and it's relevant to all of us, and it intersects with life. And I think that's really interesting that that person is consciously engaging with technology and how and when they want to use it. Like I was listening to a neuroscientist and she was saying, phones should actually come with a health warning and hopefully in the future they will. And I was like, yeah, that's a
Hmm.
really valid point, actually. And as you were talking earlier, I was thinking, yeah, how crucial it is to consider our information diet
Mm.
and
Well,
our
yeah,
tech diet, like instead of being at the default, considering actually, how do I want to utilize my time and where?
yeah. Well, there's been some interesting court cases in the US actually just this last week on that very point. So Meta has actually lost a couple of cases. And one of them was actually around the addictive nature of their platforms. So they were deliberately creating tools that were addictive, in the same way that gambling
Yeah,
or any kind of opioid addiction is actually addictive, same
yeah.
sort of things. And they've actually lost that case. The write-ups about her is saying that it might be their big tobacco moment. This might be the point where they get pulled apart a little bit because there's a lot coming, and we need to choose, how we engage with it. And like I belong to this songwriting group called How to Write Songs, and some of the people in it, and it's a debate actually going on in it, is about the use of AI in songwriting. And because there's tools out there now. There's one called Suno, which a lot of people are using, and you can put stuff into it. Like if you say, if you've written a bit of a track or something, or you can got a bit of an audio of how it goes, it'll orchestrate it up. You can put in the lyrics, and it'll dial up a great singer to sing your song for you, and it sounds absolutely amazing when it comes out. I've got to say, having had friends and known people who've used it, like the end product is absolutely phenomenal. Um, but the big con of it though is that when those people who show me one track and I think, oh my God, that's phenomenal. Like, that's incredible that it's given you that. Then by the time they show me their third track that they've used these tools for, I'm actually starting to feel a little bit bored, and it's like, because I find it's actually moving to the norm. Like even, the most average songwriter has more variety in how they go about, their craft than these tools do. But the other thing I feel that they're losing is like, well, what is the art that you are doing when you write a song or do something? The art actually is the struggle. It is actually finding a topic. It is distilling it down. It is the process of, coming up with the words and mapping a rhythm to it. It's then going out and finding, if you don't play, if you don't sing, it's going out and finding people to work with you, and you create relationships through your art. And if you're just using a tool just to spit you out the answer, you lose the process. And the process is actually more important than the answer. You know, going back to my childhood, when you did a math test, I don't know others, but did a math test when I went to school, particularly with the more complicated problems. If you just wrote down the answer, you'd fail the question because they didn't want to see the answer. They wanted to see how you got to the answer. And you could actually pass the question even if you got the answer wrong, if you made your case in your process of answering the question. The
Mm,
process, the process is the art. The outcome is just, it's an outcome and it's beautiful and you can enjoy it. And if you've done a good job, other people enjoy it too. But the real art is actually what you did to get there. And I
yeah.
think, these tools, they miss all of that actually. It's you miss that beautiful human experience that you gain. Yeah. Um,
And that creative journey. It's funny talking about this because I was just speaking to someone today about this in the form of copywriting and writing. This person was talking about writing a book,
mm,
and then we went up to articles and all these sorts of things. And they said, I can also tell, I can feel when something has been written by a human and when it hasn't.
mm.
And like they're talking about sensing that resonance and sensing that creative struggle. And yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, it's a fascinating idea, and it's again, and then that response to technology. Well, what do you do about that? How do you respond to technology? So at the moment, I'm really obsessed with looking at stories about how humans interact with stories, and again, I'm trying to find patterns. And like, for example, a lot of my friends and maybe listeners of your podcast, see, back in my back when I was dating, you just went out and met people. Really, I met my wife at a pub. It was literally meeting, eyes locking across a crowded room. But these days, that's actually a rare story. Most people are finding each other online these days, and it's often a really wriggly road that they're traveling to actually find something. Like they go through a lot of grief. And when I think about it, thinking about the idea of frequency and probability again, like it's not really in the business model of a dating app to actually allow people to find love. It's really to keep them on the hook, so they are hoping they'll find love. The longer you can string it out, probably the better. But then I'm looking at how people are reacting to that experience, and then what are they saying? What are their stories from that experience? And I'm so very intrigued about that. As I wrote a song the other week, which is looking at cyberbullying of particularly of women actually, who have a profile, public profile, through sport or media or entertainment and others. And there are guys probably like me, to be honest, look who, my age or whatever, who really go for these women in the most toxic way you can imagine. And I was surprised at how many stories of that were out there. There was like it was I did not have to look far. There was hundreds of them, and they did distill down into some really core themes. And so, I'm intrigued by how we're reacting to this.
Mm,
What does this mean for our definition of ourselves and how we define ourselves?
mm,
Just to
mm.
come back to the idea of frequency, though, because I'm conscious that you said before it's about an hour. We've actually been going for about an hour, by the way. I don't know if you realize that, Sarah. But I thought a good humorous ending to this would be to look at possibly the most popular category of song of all time.
Oh,
Yep, which is the love song. And
can't say I'm surprised.
you know, so, there's actually a great song which goes on, they say the world has had enough of silly love songs. It's literally the opening line of a song. And but the trouble is, when you look at it, and there's been people have actually, other than me, by the way, have actually researched this, and about 60 to 70% of all songs are actually about love themed. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to take this idea of love songs and look at it from a topic analysis point of view. let's unpack the love song. Like, what is what are love songs actually about? So the first thing I need to do is actually look at what is love? And to find some scientific research about what love is. Because if you really want to know what love is, you should ask a scientist after all. And actually, I did find a scientist who classified this. By the way, the whole idea of scientists classifying love amuses me greatly, I gotta say.
Same. Yep.
But um, but I felt it really added into the journey that I was undertaking here. And I found this classifier. It was actually who actually looked at, classifications of love into like infatuation, desire, sexual desire and attachment and all these different things. And I thought, well, okay, that's interesting. And then I thought, well, let's look at how love songs come out from a topic analysis. So I found the 100 top love songs of all time. There's actually a list. Someone has actually done this of the 100 top selling love songs of all time. And I analyzed it to see, okay, well, what are the lyrics actually telling me? And what I discovered is that, they do divvy out into some categories, which is like unrequited love. So there's a lot of songs about unrequited love, which is kind of like infatuation. There's wooing songs. So there's someone is trying to seduce someone through a song, which is a desire, I guess. Then there's the idea of you're in love, but it's new, like it's brand new and it's fresh and it's hot and it's wonderful and you're obsessed with it. And I thought, well, that's attachment. It's such strong attachment. And then as love ages, the story starts to wind back a little bit sometimes. So you can be in love, but it might have conditions attached to it. There's been some learnings, there's been a little bit of a journey here, and you say, okay, we're still in love, but, you know, we'll stay together provided this occurs. And then, people start to fall out. So, there's the Don't Leave Me song. Like I please, there's actually a lot of songs where one person's basically begging the other not to go. And then it has ended, but they're actually still kind of in love. So that it's complicated song. And then, they're separated. And then the breakup, of course, like, which is like, I'm now dumping everything on the other person. I like they're the worst person I've ever met. And I'm going to get better despite them. And so Taylor Swift, for example, has made a real career out of that type of song. There's quite her oeuvre is actually full of it. And then, of course, there's the idea of higher love. And so there's some really beautiful songs which are talking about like a spiritual or a religious kind of love too, which is absolutely gorgeous. In fact, some of my favorite ones actually fall into that category. So there's all these different categories of love song out there. And it's not just one thing. And statistically, because we're going to do the probability statistic things, the in love song, like when actually two people are in love, is most of them. Like it's a bit over a third of all songs. People are actually in love and they're happy, which I find personally really quite optimistic, actually, having done that analysis and realized that we actually are largely writing about something that we're happy. We're actually happy people rather than sad people, which I think is beautiful. Anyway, I just sort of give you that because it was an exercise in analysis and in a frequency in a slightly comedic way. So, I mean, this was not serious research, but I think it had some interesting and funny results that came out of it, nonetheless. Yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting. And I also find it funny this scientist definition of love. And of course there are so many definitions of love, and as the Greeks say, there's like 8 definitions of love. And I think as possibly as a Western culture, we go very quickly to the romantic love that being
Mm.
our first connotation. But of course, there's friendship love, familial love,
That's
universal
right.
love, you know,
It, it,
self-love.
that's right. It goes on. And, I would encourage everybody to think of a love song to write, but maybe to try and pick something different. You know,
Mm, mm.
the friendship love song, for example, is an underexplored area.
Absolutely.
Mm. So, I don't know of many examples of that. Buddy song. I mean, there's buddy movies out there, so there should be buddy songs, couldn't like? I guess You've Got a Friend in Me. That would probably be one.
Oh yeah.
That's a great song. I mean, that's a buddy song. But yeah, I think
Yeah.
we need
Love
more
that.
of those.
Mm, mm. Bernard, before we wrap up today, do you have any final thoughts or anything you just wish people knew?
Wish people knew. I guess my final thought is that, I love the idea of frequency because, ultimately our universe and our world is permeated by frequency all the time. We have sound around us, which is a frequency. Gravitational waves wash through us, and that's a frequency. You know, waveforms and frequency are part of us. And as a being that is mostly water, that's what humans are, we resonate with these frequencies all the time. And these frequencies do move and connect between us. And I think that's a quite a lovely sort of almost spiritual thought that, all this stuff that's moving is actually moving through us and moving through our neighbors. And so these things do link us together in these bigger patterns. So I think your topic for your podcast is beautiful because it is an idea that actually everybody literally resonates with.